have to do the trade policy review. What do you have in your mind when you're reading through the documents? Have you read them all? Okay, because we don't have much time here to wait for your answer. This is what I suggest. Now you take note of these 3 questions, okay? You come back to the document after the class, try to figure out what exactly the questions is about and how can you answer these questions. And by the next, at the beginning of the next class, I'll try to take a few minutes to going through these kinds of questions, because we don't have time here to wait for your answer. Okay, you need to prepare before the class. And when you read through the document, you may have these things in mind. Maybe it's not much clear, but you may have a few things. And so right here at this step, you try to speak it out, try to show your understanding about specific issues, and then we can, based on that kind of knowledge, we can discuss with that, because we cannot talk about all the things here in the class. And also, if you don't spend time reading through the document before the class, you cannot get the idea what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is the last message to remind you that you have to strictly follow the requirements of the instructor. And so we save these 3 questions till next seminar. Okay. Now we come back to the slide. Okay. Now we are right here. We are stopped right here. Decision making in the WTO. And now you know the idea that they apply consensus. Sometimes, if they cannot get the consensus, they apply the majority voting. Okay, and in special cases, they also apply unanimity. And also when we jump into the dispute settlement system of the WTO, you may have one more kind of applying decision making in the system, but we save it for the next class. We don't need to make it too messy right here. Okay. Now here, that is the decision making. Please spend more time reading through Article 9 and 10, reading through the document, send it to you, and try to figure out the leading questions, the guiding questions which I put on the slide. Now, also, there's one more homework for you to do at this stage. I need you to figure out how consensus gonna be organized in the system. Now, what you need to do is you have to skimming through the Marrakesh agreement and try to find out any article, any note or footnotes which they explain how consensus going to be organized in a conference, like let's say at the ministerial conference or at the general council conference. How they're going to be organized, how they be held to apply consensus. Okay, and so that is the homework you have to prepare, and next time we're going to talk about that. Right, now we've moved on to sources of the WTO. Now here, in order to have an idea about the agreement structure of the WTO, you need to find out the annex of the WTO agreement. Maybe it's better to share it on the screen. Okay, so now here you see in front of your eyes the WTO agreement, and we are on Annex 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the Marrakesh Agreement. Now here you can see the full list of all the agreement which has been agreed under the Uruguay round, and now come into a part or contribute to a part of the agreement under the WTO system. Now you can see here Annex 1A, which mentioned the multilateral agreement on trade in goods. Okay, and also below you can see a different agreement in trade in goods, which can be mentioned here. Article agreement on agriculture, agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, textile and clothing, technical barriers to trade (TBT), trade-related investment measure (TRIMs), and agreement on the implementation of Article 6, which is about anti-dumping, agreement on implementation of Article 7, also agreement on pre-shipment inspections, rules of origin, etc. Now here's our own size agreement in the fields of goods. Okay, now next, in our next 1B, you have general agreement on trade in services. Now, Annex 1C, agreement on trade related to aspect of intellectual property rights. Now here, in Annex 1, you see that there's all kinds of trade, multilateral trade agreement inside the organizations. In Annex 3, it is the dispute settlement understanding. Annex, that is Annex 2, beg your pardon. Annex 2 on the DSU. And Annex 3 about the trade policy review mechanism, which I have mentioned earlier. Now for Annex 4, they talk about the plurilateral trade agreement, which includes 4 side agreement on civil aircraft, government procurement, dairy agreement, and bovine meat agreement. Now, for people who working in legal fields, the questions arising here is that whether all those agreements are compulsory, because you have you've heard about that the WTO have applied the single undertaking rules. That means the members of the WTO have to be the members of all the multilateral agreement inside the system. And so does it mean that all the agreement included in Annex 1, 2, 3, and 4 are compulsory? Now, to figure out these questions, you need to read through Article 2 of Marrakesh Agreement. Okay, and we come back to Article 2. Just spend a little time reading through the text, and then we discuss about that later. Okay. Okay, now here you see that in Article 2, they state how these kinds of agreement listed in Annex 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the Marrakesh Agreement has been binding amongst the WTO member. Now, the agreement for Article 2, Paragraph 2, the agreement and associated legal instruments included in Annex 1, 2, and 3. Here, in after refers to as multilateral trade agreement. Now, these are integral parts of this agreement, which can be bind on members, right? So, on the agreement in the list of multilateral trade agreement will be compulsory for all the WTO members. All right. And so for the next one, the plurilateral trade agreement listed in Annex 4, it's also part of the Marrakesh Agreement, but it's only create the obligations for the member who have accepted this agreement. And so that is under the WTO system, that the plurilateral trade agreement are not compulsory, and it depends on the WTO member themselves to decide whether to join those kind of agreement or not. And so when we come back to the concept of single undertaking, it's only focused on Annex 1 on trade in goods, services, and rules on trips, right? And on Annex 2 on dispute settlement understanding, and on Annex 3 on the trade policy review. Those are all binding agreement under the system. That's the things you need to keep in mind. Now we come back to the slide. Okay, now right here, for sources of the WTO law, what things you have to learn about the system is that only multilateral agreements are binding, and for plurilateral agreement is optional. And normally these kinds of agreement right now are on expire. For the secondary sources of law, the WTO also have the dispute settlement report, which is also another kind of document of sources for the interpreting of the WTO law, and also acts of different WTO bodies. But here, for the secondary sources of law, you don't have to put your focus on that, because this just to introduce to you for further research into the system. Right now, right here, you only focus on the multilateral agreements, and that's enough. Now, here's a kind of a little summary on the WTO rules that may help you to easier get into the system. Okay, now here, you need to keep in mind, multilateral agreements are on bindings, right? And so here we have on the top, agreement establishing the WTO, right? And in goods, services, and intellectual properties, we also have different agreement GATT in services, and trade. Now these are three groups of agreement in groups of multilateral trade agreement. Okay, and also dispute settlement and trade policy review are also a part of multilateral trade agreement under the system. And these agreement presented in this slide are on the rules which is mandatory. in the system to in order to be the member of the WTO, countries, nations, a custom territory have to accept all these kinds of agreement. Now here, that is the requirement of single undertaking. Now here you can see on the slide, I put them here, the GATT on services, TRIP, DSU, and TPRM, all in one. And it means that, as I have mentioned earlier, that in order to be a member of the WTO, a nation's whether it is a rich or poor country, a well-developed or a less developed country, they have to accept all the rules designed and included in the multilateral trade agreement groups of the WTO. Now, about the WTO memberships and accessions. Now for this part, I listed here Article 11 and Article 12, and it's better to you to read through the text of Marrakesh Agreement and find out what is the difference between original membership and members by accessions in the system. Because they have two kinds of members inside the WTO system. What is the difference between them, and is there any kinds of special right dedicated to the original member or not? You need to read through the text of Marrakesh Agreement, and maybe if you have time, reading through the book of Peter van den Bosch to have the idea. Okay, now for this part, I need you to prepare these kinds of discussion questions, saving for the next class. Now here we have 4 questions. Some of them has been mentioned earlier in today's class, and so you come back to, as I have mentioned, you come back to the law and the supporting documents, reading through them, trying to figure out these kinds of questions. And by the next class, at the maybe for the first 15 minutes of the next class, I'll try to solve and explain all these questions. And because we don't have much more time, I did prepare a few very, for me, interesting issues relating to the system, but we don't have much time. And so maybe we save it for another day when we have free time, and then we can come back to these selected issues of the system. All right. Any questions right here, class? Hello? No questions. No questions. That mean you understand all the things I have discussed today, or that means you have no idea about that, and then you don't have anything in return. Now, class, I need to remind you, things cannot be organized like this, because you will not get anything in this course if you continue to keep these kinds of acting in the class. Okay, we need to discuss, we need to interchange our knowledge and thought, and you need, in order to do so, you need to prepare it before the class. And so I hope for next class is gonna be this situation gonna be like better. And if you need anything else in order to support your studying, from my side, please don't hesitate to mention it. All right. Now, if there's no more questions, we stop right here, and see you next Thursday.
Thank you very much. See you next time.